All right. Well, again, thank you for being here. It looks like we've got everyone in from the waiting room. So I want to welcome you to our first public meeting for the Tomales Bay Bulkhead Vulnerability Assessment. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us tonight. Looking forward to getting you up to speed on the project, addressing your questions, and getting you all back home again in time for dinner. So my name is Julia Elkin. I am an advanced planner with the Marin County Community Development Agency. I am managing this effort as well as the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant that funds the project. I'll tell you all about that this evening. Tonight's meeting is being recorded, and that recording, along with the materials that you're going to see tonight, those will be posted to the County Advanced Planning website in the coming weeks. So after this meeting, I'll be sending a follow-up email when that web link is available to the recording. I'm going to share over my presentation. Just bear with me for just a minute here. All right. Well, again, welcome. So I'd like to review what we're going to cover tonight. I'm going to start by providing a broad project introduction, some context for you on why the county is funding this study, and an overview of our project timeline. Then I'll be handing it over to Mike Jewett, our consultant team lead at Miller Pacific Engineering Group. Mike will further introduce the project team and provide you more details on the assessment approach, the technical analyses, and the anticipated outcomes. And I want to assure you we have scheduled ample time for question and answer following Mike's presentation. So please hold your questions until the latter part of the meeting. But that said, if something's like really on your mind and you want to capture that question, you can go ahead and enter it into the Zoom chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And when you open that, please direct your questions to me. You'll see the option, Julia. Send me your questions and we'll be sure to address them when we get to the Q&A this evening. So a few Zoom housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees are currently muted. During the question and answer, we will be using the raise hand function to make sure that we address everyone's questions. So to raise your hand, you hover your mouse over the little reaction icon at the bottom of your screen, and you are able to select the raise hand option. And we'll call through the list of raised hands. When you're called on, you can unmute yourself by clicking on that microphone icon at the bottom of your screen. Just please be sure to remute yourself when you're done speaking to allow other participants. And you're welcome to participate tonight with your video on or off. Please do what feels comfortable for you. If you'd like to turn on your video, you can click the Start Video icon at the bottom of your screen. All right, so some quick introductions to who you'll be meeting tonight. You've already met me, and I'm joined this evening by two members of our terrific consulting team, Mike Jewett with Miller Pacific Engineering Group and Trevor Even with Adaptation International. And they'll further introduce themselves and their organizations in a few minutes. I'd like to also take a moment to acknowledge our project funder, FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is administered in partnership with California Office of Emergency Services. And I'd really like to thank Caltrans District 4 staff, as well as the members of the East Shore Planning Group. They have provided critical advice and local perspective throughout the development of this project. And Caltrans and East Shore Planning Group participated in the county's consultant selection process for this assessment. They reviewed project scopes of work and have assisted on public outreach. So they've been really generous in providing their time and local expertise. Thank you. All right, so now I'm going to start telling you what this project is all about. And I think the best place to start tonight is by answering the question of why is the county conducting a vulnerability assessment of bulkheads along East Shore Tomales Bay? And the answer to that is that this assessment was recommended by prior county reports that examined sea level rise vulnerabilities in coastal Marin. So back in 2015, the county conducted an ocean coast sea level rise vulnerability assessment. And that was done through the C-SMART process. And that assessment found that the east shore of Tomales Bay and that Marshall are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges, and that pier-based and shoreline housing can act as a first line of defense for shoreline highway. And that assessment recognized that the East Shore faces unique challenges because you have bayside houses that inadvertently serve to armor shoreline highway from flooding impacts. So the loss or the compromise of shoreline houses could possibly impact the highway as well. From there, in 2018, you're following little arrows across your screen here. In 2018, the county subsequently produced an adaptation report. And that report called for a further investigation of the shoreline highway vulnerability along Tomales Bay in the East Shore area to determine whether bulkheads below homes help protect the highway. And the recommendation was, if it is found that bulkheads protect the highway, then there should be an examination of long-term adaptation strategies for continued protection in collaboration with homeowners. So, in response to those reports, a bulkhead vulnerability assessment was identified as a project to-do item in the county's local hazard mitigation plan. And that was an important step. So getting this project into the local hazard mitigation plan made it qualify for FEMA funding. So in 2020, when the county received a FEMA hazard mitigation planning grant as part of a multi-departmental county-wide initiative for updating the hazard mitigation plan, this project assessment was able to receive some of that funding. And that is why the county is here today conducting this study. And without taking you too deep into the world of planning, I want to point out that FEMA-funded hazard mitigation planning is very valuable because it can position projects to receive future federal funding support. To date, just as a note, Marin has received over $10 million in FEMA hazard mitigation funding. And that supported projects including home elevations throughout the county, seismic retrofits, stormwater pond flood mitigation, berm improvements, and other activities. So I realize this whole story is a lot of plans, but each plan has refined our understanding of the coastal hazards that the East Shore faces. And these plans allow us to go further in the adaptation planning process toward identifying more specific vulnerabilities and getting to conceptual adaptation options. As an added note, since a lot of this is a discussion about adjacency to shoreline highway, I want to note that Caltrans District 4 has conducted their own climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation priorities for that roadway. And this county study that we're undertaking will be providing those further details that can be helpful to Caltrans as they address vulnerable assets along shoreline highway. All right, so before I go further, I want to note that for the purposes of this assessment, the word bulkhead is being defined as bulkheads, foundations, piers, caissons, and other improvements that protect the properties and infrastructure along the east shore of Tomales Bay. No need to write that down. I will be sharing this recording after the meeting. Just so you know, when we're saying bulkheads, we're using the term to refer to that broader body of shoreline structures. I also want to be really clear on the purpose of this assessment. So I want to be clear what this assessment is and what it is not. It is analyzing existing structures' integrity and their continued ability to protect homes, roadways, and assets from flooding. This assessment is developing several high-level conceptual options for structural rehabilitation, replacement, or improvement. This study is to raise locals' awareness, so thank you for coming this evening. The county wants residents to be aware of potential sea level rise vulnerabilities And this information could inform individual or coordinated responses to these vulnerabilities. And finally, this assessment, as I said, is a valuable step toward qualifying for possible future federal. All right, so what this assessment is not. This assessment is not a commitment by the county to implement any conceptual project options identified by the assessment. The assessment is not part of the local coastal plan update or the environmental hazards policy development, so we won't be speaking to that tonight. And finally, this assessment is not a regulatory or permit compliance action. And I want to emphasize that last point because the project team recognizes that bulkheads and other shoreline structures can be sensitive topics for property owners. So the project team is committed to maintaining stakeholder anonymity and data security throughout this assessment. To this end, the project team, the county, our consultants have all signed an official firewall letter. And this was reviewed prior to signature by the East Shore Planning Group. The firewall letter confirms that all non-public information gathered by the project consultants will only be provided to the county as aggregate data. So specific information regarding individual properties will be held confidentially by the contractors and not disclosed to the county or others without respective property owners' prior written consent to such a disclosure. Also, the firewall letter confirms that the project will be consistent with CDA's site inspection policy. So as some of you know, there was a similar commitment made in connection with inspections of East Shore septic systems for the proposed Marshall Community Wastewater System. So it's following that successful precedent to respect that this is not a permit compliance activity. All right, so the fun stuff. Here's a look at the project timeline. It's a pretty concise effort. We are starting now and we'll be wrapping up the assessment by spring of 2022, sorry. We're here today at the project's kickoff meeting. Fieldwork and technical analyses will be conducted this fall, and you'll hear more details about that in just a moment from Mike. And then this winter, we'll be coming back to you to share project results with a final report available by April of 2022. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Jewett with Miller Pacific Engineering Group to share more details about the project. Over to you, Mike.
Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Julia, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I apologize in advance for the bad lighting and camera work here, so please forgive me. Again, my name is Mike Jewett. I'm with Miller Pacific Engineering Group. I will be the one performing the on-site inspections, which obviously are probably the most impactful part of this project, and I imagine there's some curiosity about that. As a means of brief introduction, I moved to Marin in 1998. I went to Tam High in Mill Valley and graduated from Sonoma State with a geology degree and have been working here for the last 14 years. Most of our work is in Marin and the North Bay. Some of you in attendance, I believe we've worked together previously. There go my office lights. And so we have lots of experience. You know, both our firm and me personally have done a lot of work in Tomales Bay and around West Marin. Our expertise is really in evaluating geologic hazards and developing mitigation alternatives. We currently maintain lots of infrastructure and stability related databases for the County of Marin and several cities and towns within it. We've also performed these similar sea level rise and coastal flooding type analyses for the county, for the flood controlled zone, Town of Corte Madera, Belvedere, and some other municipalities. So this is work we're familiar with, and also an area that we are, intimately familiar with, and in a way consider ourselves stakeholders as well. We're all locals, and bottom line, we have a similar vested interest in building resilience as a county here. So with that, wanted to describe for you a little bit the extent of our project. The map you're looking at now It shows the limits of our study area, and I imagine that everybody in attendance is connected somehow to one of the properties on this map. One thing to note is that the study area is comprised only of those properties on the water side, the west side of Highway 1. And so one obvious parcel on this map, the Marconi Center at the right hand of the page, is not part of this study area. But for the purpose of visualization, you're all likely familiar with Marconi at the south end and with Nick's Cove at the north end. So that's the area that we'll be working in, and that is the area which I am charged with inspecting structures. On the next slide, I wanted to show you one of the pages here. This is the south end of our study area. This is drawn from that 2018 report that Julia briefly described in her introduction. The basic gist of this figure is that it shows areas in which existing buildings are susceptible to sea level rise. And the various colors there correspond to different levels of sea level rise. As you can see, there's quite a bit of area along the shoreline that's deemed susceptible. Now, the next figure will show the northern area and give you a sense for what things look like there. The overall takeaway is that there are clearly lots of structures exposed here. Even at the minimal sea level rise scenario in bright red, it shows 103 structures, and at the maximum worst case scenario shows over 160. Now understand, these appear to have been focused on buildings, which are themselves not necessarily the focus of this study. More on this in a second. So to get into a little bit what my intent is with the site inspections, I'll have you go to the next slide. I will be the one doing them. I will be the one personally there, not dispatching other minions or anything like that. And what I am looking for is very focused on these bulkheads themselves. I am there looking to document their location, the dimensions and type of construction, and ideally the condition. The purpose of this is partly to determine how many of these may be adequate to resist the effects of sea level rise and how many may not be. These photos are not from our project area, but are examples of typical older infrastructure in similar environments that I've dealt with. And the types of things I'd be looking to document here are approximate exposed heights, spacing and type of pile supports, and evidence of distress. There's lots of rotten lagging. There's evidence of settlement of those concrete pier blocks on the right side. I am not interested in the residence structure above necessarily at this stage, and I am not interested to inspect portions of the property unrelated to this sort of coastline infrastructure directly. Have you skip one more, Julia? I had scoped this to do the inspections over the course of 2 days, and there's obviously a fair amount of ground to cover. For the sake of efficiency, I intend to work north to south through the project area so that I can park on the west side of shoreline and not be crossing traffic. The goal is to access as much of this as I can under public access doctrine from below the mean higher water, where public access is allowed on the beach. In other words, there is no need for me to enter the property, to come in from the water side, or to be otherwise involved with anything beyond that immediate coastline infrastructure. Those 2 days, I'll do the best I can to document what I can from a distance as needed. I may want to approach structures from the waterfront. Again, at no point is there any reason for me to be inland of whatever is fronting the shoreline there. As far as data gaps, I imagine there will be some areas that are inaccessible by this means. I know there are some areas where the houses themselves are founded on pilings, where there is no beach underneath them, where there are some extensive retaining walls that may extend to the water. The intent is to do as much as I can over the course of 2 days, compile the data that we're able to get at minimal disturbance or to anybody there. And then depending on the extent to which there are gaps in the data that would lend more value to our project if they were rectified, we may consider reaching out to individuals if that is determined to be valuable enough information. But I think the overall goal is to access and inspect as much of this as I can in as low impact and unobtrusive a manner as I can do. And so therefore the intent is to use beach access as much as possible. You may see me out there. I will make myself plainly visible with a vest and some business cards. Do feel free to come and say hi, but please do not be alarmed. The only goal is to take some measurements and move along to the next structure that is on the list for inspection. Flip slides for me there. So once the inspections are done and we've compiled all this information on what kind of structures we have, where they are, what they're made of, and what kind of shape they're in, the goal here is to determine how many of these are really in suitable condition to limit or mitigate the impacts of expected future sea level rise. To be frank, my anticipation based on experience with West Marin is that a large portion of the infrastructure may not really be in suitable condition, but that is exactly what we're here to understand. The goal here is to provide a visualization of expected impacts, both from sea level rise and from episodic coastal flooding, which happens every year with the big rainstorms. It should be noted that in the near term, the episodic flooding will present a greater risk than long-term sea level rise. Trevor can speak to that in a little more detail if desired. Ultimately, the intended product here is to compile essentially an inventory of existing structures that lie within areas we expect to be inundated by higher sea levels. And of those structures, identify how many of them will need to be considered for either modification or replacement in order to protect the existing assets along the shoreline and keep them viable for the future. One more slide. So deliverable products, again, our goal here is to deliver the county an objective assessment of sea level rise and coastal flooding risk based on the inventory and accumulated data arising from my field inspections. Once the extent and nature of those vulnerable structures is better defined, we will develop some conceptual options for improvement or replacement where necessary to mitigate sea level rise and episodic flooding. These will be generally conceptual in nature and are intended to provide sort of that next step of planning level information required to either consider beginning the design phase or funding mechanism exploration or other processes required to take the next step. And then lastly is really to provide a foundation for procurement of future funding. As Julia mentioned, the overarching goal of this is to build enough documentation of the risk that exists to trigger the availability of outside funding to put some of this in place in the future. On the acknowledgement that these types of projects are really difficult to pull together as an individual in 2021 California. The one limitation that people should be aware of is that following this study, there will need to be future phases of work in order to achieve the end goal of improving whatever infrastructure is necessary to mitigate these impacts. Those future phases of work will need eventually to be site-specific geotechnical, civil, structural evaluations to refine the concepts and develop actual designs. That scope of work clearly is some time away pending the results of this study and development of some further mechanisms by which to prompt that next course of action.